Away they go. Cathy's final campaign is on the road. Ogunkoya leads sailing. Then Freeman, Guevara, Graham, Merry. Over on the inside, Fraser collared by Cotley Arava. Still in stagger formation. 250 to run. Freeman well placed. Challenge is going to come from Graham, who's running a big first 200. Merry working away through as well. Ogunkoya still in front of sailing. Freeman working away through. Graham's going to come at a hard. So is Merry. 130 to run beneath the Olympic flame as they head towards the straight. And Graham is just in front of Freeman. She's going to have to work. Graham, Merry, Freeman. Freeman gets to the front. Freeman leads by a metre. Graham fighting on, but Freeman is too good. The crowd roaring. Freeman wins gold. Cathy's the winner. Australia the winner. Cathy Freeman is a national hero.
Well, that'll go down as one of the great calls in the history of Olympic broadcasting. Tim Lane's call on the ABC back in 2000. I'm sure he was as nervous as anyone, but you wouldn't have known how professional, polished and brilliant that call was of Cathy Freeman winning gold. It's a great pleasure to welcome one of the great broadcasters in the history of broadcasting. I was lucky enough to work with him for a long time at the ABC, Timothy Paul Lane. Tim, thanks for joining us on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans.
To be with you, Dashing. We haven't worked on the same program for a while, so it's good to be alongside you again.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Well, what can you remember about the Sydney Olympics, which was your fifth and last one? Were you nervous calling that race, as nervous as everyone else was for Cathy Freeman?
I've been nervous in the lead up. In fact, months out, I'd kind of circled the date on the calendar and the time of day, and I imagined that when that gun went off, one could be close to choking point. But I remember on the night, Alan Marks, our producer, had Peter Hadfield and I doing about 20 minutes of lead up to the event. So we'd got good and relaxed, almost to the point of when the gun went off, thinking, God, the race is on. So it sort of crept up on me a little bit. But I don't know, I just settled into the rhythm of it, and nerves didn't become the factor that I thought they possibly could, and that was good, because they're the moments. And I suppose that speaks of experience, that I'd been broadcasting by that time for getting on for 30 years, and you hear sports people talking about the process and the routine and that sort of thing, and without consciously seeking to actually do that, I think it just happened and it took care of itself.
Hearing the race, and you would have heard the race a few times now, do you sit back and think that was almost perfect, or do you sit back and think I could have done this better, I could have done that differently?
I think the first two or three times I thought it was, I pretty well nailed it, but I have heard it a number of times. I mean, it gets trotted out for anniversaries and that sort of thing. So I've almost heard it more times now than I'd want to hear it. And I suppose it's like this with artists and the things they do, that you start to find the imperfections in your own work. They might be imperfections that other people don't see. But, there are just little moments, little repetitions and that sort of thing. The start of the race almost, as I said before, almost surprised me. And I remember Drew Morford had said to me, because my first really big call of an athletics event, and the biggest thing I'd done in my broadcasting life to that stage, was Raylene Boyle's 400 metres in Brisbane in 1982 at the Commonwealth Games. And Drew had said to me, maybe at about the time of the Sydney Olympics, how good he thought my opening to that was. And it just happened. The gun went off, and I said they're off, and a huge roar splits the air at QE2, which was the name of the stadium back then. And the same words almost came out of my mouth in Sydney without the QE2. But I thought, no, I can't do that again. Drew will think I've only got one opening. So I just had to modify it on the run, and I felt it was slightly clumsy, but away we went after that.
Well, he had that famous line, of course, in '84 at the LA Olympics in the cycling. He said, "Look at the Americans' bikes, the American bikes. I mean, they're high tech, and the Australians have got bikes that you deliver the mail in. I mean, that'll go down as one of the great lines of all time. I mean, when you are delivering a line, Tim, is it premeditated or does it come off the cuff? And do you think it's better if it comes off the cuff?
Well, I think it is, because you can surprise yourself when you do that. But and in premeditating them, and lots of people do it now. I think it's kind of become the go-to plan. I don't do much of it, but I must admit, in the lead up to that race, I did think that there does need to be a good exclamation mark on this, and so the way the call of the race climaxed was kind of planned. But I don't, as a rule, do that, because I think you can get yourself into strife. If it just doesn't work out. I remember many years ago, probably the first time I ever tried all this, there was a bloke picked in the Clarence footy team in Hobart, and his name was David Garlick, and he was playing at full forward. Hobart's fullback was a bloke named Peter Ratcliffe.
Right.
And I thought, if Ratcliffe gets the ball at any stage and Garlick's chasing him, I'm going to be able to say he's got garlic breathing down his neck. And at the first bounce, Clarence went into attack. Garlick's on the lead. I said, "Out comes Garlick. He's got Ratcliffe breathing down his neck." I broke up because I realised I'd completely stuffed it up. So you've got to be a bit careful of that. If you script your lines, they can go amiss.
Now, with athletics, when did you start broadcasting athletics? Was it in your days in Tassie at the ABC, or when you got to Melbourne in 1979?
I got a little bit lucky I think it was during the centenary test, actually, in 77. The National Track and Field Championships were being held in Hobart.
Right.
And we did the ABC did a TV OB of that, and I was the commentator, the caller of races, working with an expert commentator. And I did one or two races, but I felt reasonably well. The men's 200, I remember, I just kind of went for broke, and it worked out well. And in the week or two afterwards, the sort of otherwise invisible bosses up in Sydney, who were just names, and they were very daunting names, like Bernie Kerr and John O'Reilly and Bert Oliver. Bernie sent a memo. This was the days, well before email.
Yep.
And a pink memorandum came down to the Hobart Sport Office, and it was quite complimentary of the work I'd done. So I think there was perhaps, an eye out for me, and the possibility that I might be handy as a track and field commentator. Noel Bailey, who had been the voice of track and field on the ABC, more radio than TV, but he wasn't far from retirement at that stage. So I think they were looking for a bit of new blood. And out of the blue, I landed the job for Brisbane in 82. I'd been to Stawell twice by then and broadcast the gift, and done some national championships. So I'd been given a chance to strut my stuff. I wasn't entirely confident going to Brisbane, and I remember the game started, and the track and field didn't start until about 5 days in. And so I would be working away in my hotel room, and I'd have the TV going, and I'm hearing everyone else calling the house down, and was sort of quite toey about the possibility that I could be the weakest link once the athletics started. But there's nothing like the big occasion, I guess, and being thrown off the deep end, and away you go. And so it was. And Raylene was a huge event, and then of course Deke won the marathon. Although that was very different, because we were just calling it from a studio, and it was quite challenging in a different way.
All-time great sports broadcaster Tim Lane has joined me talking about the Olympics as part of Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures. for Aussie home loans, dealing with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. Areas of expertise include purchasing a property, owner-occupied or investment, building a property portfolio, refinancing, debt consolidation, cash-out construction, pre-approvals, first-home buyers, and all sorts of loans, including equipment, car, and personal loans. So after doing the Commonwealth Games in 82, Tim, and then, of course, Channel 10 got the TV rights for LA in 84, were you confident to get the radio calling gig for the track and field in LA?
I'm confident of getting it.
Yeah, were you confident?
I was pretty hopeful. I think maybe the Jungle Drums might have delivered the message to Melbourne that I would be involved, and that George Grulisic who had done quite a bit of athletics. I know he'd called some in Moscow in 1980, and I think he'd done his share of national championships. He'd done radio coverage, I think, of the 82 Commonwealth Games. So I was certainly, I didn't take anything for granted, and was really, chuffed and excited when the job came my way, and to be going to an Olympic Games, my first ever, going to LA, it was a hugely exciting time and personal opportunity.
Was it what you thought it would be, the LA Olympics?
It was. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect in some ways, but the opening ceremony, I guess, set the scene, and that was at the Coliseum. I wasn't broadcasting that. I was a junior in the team, in a sense. But it was, the LA weather and Carl Lewis, of course, and this was where he was going to be trying to equal Jesse Owens' great feat of winning the four gold medals, 3 individual and 1 relay. So it was just a mind-blowing experience, really, for a young person. It was the first time I'd been out of Australia, so it was a massive event and experience in my life.
And then, of course, in 1988, you're taken to long service leave. There was no footy on ABC TV in 88. You caddied for Vaughan Summers, the professional golfer, but you missed out on calling track and field in 88. Were you disappointed?
A little bit. It was probably a case of 3 into 2 won't go. George was still on the scene. David Morrow had broadcast some track and field at the 86 Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, and he no doubt was keen to have a crack at it. He was in Sydney, I was in Melbourne. George was a good mate of Alan Marks, who was the producer of the coverage. So I got squeezed ever so slightly, I guess, and was disappointed at the outset. But having gone away for a few months in the middle of the year, and then coming back and almost unpacking my bags and then repacking them to head off to Seoul, it wasn't such a bad thing, because track and field does require a hell of a lot of preparation. And so my preparation time perhaps would have been limited. And so to be going and doing the basketball, which felt more relaxed for me, turned out to be really good. And both the men and the women had fantastic tournaments. Both came fourth. The women with just an ounce of luck. I mean, they were beaten by 1 second, really, in their semi-final against Yugoslavia. Lost it by a point. Otherwise, they would have been playing off for the gold medal against the States. So, it was a terrific tournament from an Australian point of view. The interest in the two teams grew and grew. And so, in a way, I, felt I was at the nerve centre a bit. I mean, one downside to doing track and field is that Australia tends not to have a huge amount of success. In 84, Glynis Nunn won our only gold medal in the heptathlon. Debbie Flintoff-King, of course, in 88 in Seoul. Nothing in 92 to speak of. We're picking up a field medal along the way, but for a track caller, you're hoping for something really great on the track. And similarly, in Atlanta, there wasn't a lot to write home about. So doing something like the basketball, where every game Australia played was like doing the AFL Grand Final. It made it a really terrific Olympic Games for me, and a bit more relaxing. The track and field meets, are very demanding, and you don't really get much of a chance to be enjoying the glory of the Olympic Games while it's happening, because you're too concerned about the next day's event or the next day's program, and from one event to the next, it's full on, and each one I've done, I've been absolutely exhausted at the end of it.
Well, I mean, of course, 88 was not only Debbie Flintoff-King's great race, but was Ben Johnson's controversial moment as well. So it was all happening, as the great Bill Laurie would say, on the track and field sim itself.
It was, of course, the Ben Johnson affair didn't fully emerge until a day or two after he won the race. I remember going to breakfast in the media village. I think it might have been a Sunday morning, I can't quite remember now, and bumping into Neville Oliver, who was a part of our team, and he was a bit of a practical joker, the old nifty. And he said, where our paths just crossed in the breakfast room, he said, "Johnson, got him, drugs." And I thought, he's having a lend me, surely. And so I didn't bite. I just pressed on and got my brekkie and went and found a spot to sit down and eat it. And then Paul Jeans, who was sort of the guru of Australian track and field statistics, and maybe at that time was chairman of selectors for the international Australian teams, came and sat down where I was sitting, and I said, "Anything going on?" And I was just seeing whether he knew anything. And he said, "Well, there's a rumour around that Johnson's been done for steroids." And I thought, hello, this is it's a true story. Neville was giving me as it was, and so Paul and I then got serious about discussing what was happening.
Did you? Obviously, you had the basketball to worry about, and there was George and David covering the athletics. Were you involved in helping to find out more about that story, or it was left to the others?
Well, I certainly wasn't on the, I wasn't working as an investigative journalist, and that wasn't my working patch. So no, I was just really following it like everybody else around the globe, waiting to see what would happen next. And we all know the story well and truly now, but it was a massively big event at that time, all over the world, clearly. But I remember being on a bus, maybe later the day that news of the disqualification had emerged, and I think from memory I was sitting next to a guy who was a Canadian journalist, and we got talking about it. And this is just such a great part of being at the Olympics, that you're rubbing shoulders with all sorts of people, many of whom you wouldn't know from a bar of soap, but they have a job to do as well, and they have their sources of information. And so that conversation, even though I didn't ever find out the bloke's name, it still lives with me as a part of that story as it unfolded.
Five-time Olympic broadcaster Tim Lane is my guest on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures. Thanks to Aussie Home Loans, who deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. They've got 25 lenders as well, and they can do Zoom as well. Now, Tim, just on the basketball, how much basketball had you called? And you said the athletics requires an inordinate amount of homework. If you hadn't called much basketball, how did you get to know the game so quickly?
I'd played basketball. It had been my recreational pursuit for a few years at school initially, which I played it along with footy and cricket. But then in my ABC years in Hobart, I hooked up with a couple of mates who were playing in a basketball team, and I became a very, very dangerous point guard, Dan, and really enjoyed the sport. And when I came to Melbourne, I had told Dick Mason, who was our boss, that if there were any opportunities to broadcast basketball, I'd love to be involved. And in fact, he was in the process of getting a national coverage of the relatively new National League, established with the production and the presentation to be done out of Melbourne.
Oh.
So I became it for a while. So I had done a reasonable amount of basketball. I'd been not doing any for 3 or 4 years since that coverage that we'd done for a couple of years of the National League had ended. But, you know, I was able to fairly quickly kind of get my mind into gear. I do remember ringing Billy Mildenhall, who was just about Australia's top referee and former St Kilda footballer. And he was kind enough to come into the office one day, and we spent a couple of hours together. He was taking me through all the new rules which had been introduced since I'd last broadcasted. As it turned out, it didn't save me from a slightly embarrassing moment I think it was in that women's semi-final against Yugoslavia when... look, I'm just trying to remember the circumstances now. But anyway, there was one of the new rules kind of came into play and blindsided me just for a moment. I had Phil Smythe working with me because when the women were playing, I'd grab one of the men, and when the men were playing, I'd grab one of the women. Did a lot of work with Michelle Timms, particularly during that series of matches. And in that moment, it was the match between the Australian women and Yugoslavia was at such a fever pitch that Phil missed it as well. So I felt vaguely vindicated for the fact that one got under my guard. But anyway, you know, I'd done my prep, and it was just one of those things that could happen.
When we make a mistake as a broadcaster, I always get angry at myself. When you listen back, it's often not as bad as that. Do you feel that, Tim? You think, oh, gee, that was a shocker. I'll have to listen back to it and find out what I did wrong, but I'm not looking forward to listening back. And then you listen back to it and you're trying to pick up that it was a mistake. You know what I mean? And then you keep listening. Eventually, you'll hear.
Funny, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? I mean, sometimes it's not as bad as it seems.
Someone.
Yeah.
No, that's right. You pour your heart out to someone afterwards, and they say, "Oh, I didn't even notice." And of course, you never know whether they're just saying it to be nice or not. But there is a bit of that in it. Yeah, we're our own harshest judges with performing publicly, and we hate it when we goof up. But it does happen to everybody, and sometimes it's more apparent than others. But you're quite right. Sometimes nobody would even have noticed.
You did 5 Olympic Games. Is there one that stands out?
Oh, look, I think Sydney, because it was just so special, the second time in all the history that it had been staged in Australia. You miss out, of course, on going to a faraway host city, which is presenting itself at its absolute best. And Barcelona was magnificent in that regard. But I think the pride that every Australian experienced for those couple of weeks in 2000, once we got the Olympic flame up the ramp and alight, and we could all relax and start to really take pride in it. It was just colossal, and an experience the like of which most of us will not have again, because those of us who broadcast in Sydney are unlikely to still be doing it in 2032 in Brisbane. But it's a magnificent experience. As I said, Barcelona, I think of the ones in other countries was probably my favourite, because there was just such a rich sense of history and culture in that city. The crowds were extraordinary, and everything about those games just oozed what the Olympics ought to be, I think. But having said that, I mean, Seoul in Asia was superb. LA was my first. Probably Atlanta was the one that didn't quite live up to the billing. I think there was a general feeling. Even old Samaranch himself couldn't bring himself to say it's the greatest Olympic Games ever at the closing ceremony of Atlanta. So it was still terrific, but it probably, of those 5, was the one that pales just a little bit.
Our erstwhile colleague Glenn Mitchell joined me in the first edition of this program for Aussie Home Loans a couple of weeks ago, Tim, and I asked him about the future of the Olympic Games. Are you a bit concerned about it? Because I remember when Sydney won the race for 2000, and it was announced way back in 1993, so 7 years before the event. There were a lot of countries in for it. It was the biggest story going around, and it was a real battle as to see who would get it. Nowadays, it's virtually one country puts their hand up and they're awarded it. It's certainly changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. I haven't followed it as closely as I once might have done, but the whole Brisbane preparation, and the prophets of doom suggesting the city won't be ready and the facilities won't be good enough. But as I understand it, much of their advice has come from John Coates, who really has been the godfather of the Olympics in this country for a long, long time. And it's his advice, I think I've read, that, to go back to the people and don't be trying to ensure that ours is more expensive and grander than everyone that's gone before, and be prepared to do it in a more modest way. And I don't think there's too much wrong with that. I mean, the ceremonies and so on inevitably will be done in a really big way, and everyone will want that part of the Olympics from an Australian point of view to present the country as favourably as it possibly can. But yeah, I think we're entering a new phase because the games have got almost too big for themselves, and it is acting as a deterrent for countries, for each successive Olympics, to be prepared to buy into it. And it does make for a really interesting time. I mean, the Olympics go on facing very big issues. I think the Ben Johnson one that we discussed earlier, and doping, started something. There were those books that Andrew Jennings, the English journalist, wrote, which were calling into question the very integrity of the IOC. So there's been a lot to think about, and a lot for the people who organise the whole show to really start thinking about. But I, for one, wouldn't mind seeing the games just lower their expectation a bit. People loved the games when they were a pretty modest affair. You look at pictures of the MCG, now from this distance in 1956, and it all looks almost a bit country yokel, and yet at the time it wasn't. And they can be done in a way that is not so ostentatious, and still it can, deliver the Olympic message loud and clear and produce great sport. And that's all everyone wants to see, when the moment comes.
Well, my mum was 20 back in 1956 at the Melbourne Olympics, and she said, as a 20-year-old and a nursing student, it was the greatest time of her life. I mean, they'd go, obviously there weren't the pubs open like there are now, but everyone just had a great time and they were happy the entire time, and they just enjoyed it. It was just like a carnival, really. But I mean, it's just changed too much, hasn't it? It's politically motivated in a lot of ways, and it just costs a fortune. That's why it's changed. And do you think too, Tim, there are too many sports as well, or too many, I'd call them? I know there are people out there that love breakdancing and love sports rock climbing and things along those lines, but do you think there are almost too many recreational activities and too many sports added to particular Olympic Games?
Look, it's a bit hard for older observers like me to warm to some of these events that are being included, without any doubt, I think, to try and extend the breadth and the appeal of the Olympic Games to a new audience. And I suppose when you think about it, the modern pentathlon, for example, with all its traditional connections and so on, is not an event that too many of us knew too much about. Yeah. And yet we didn't ever question that, because we saw traditional links with it for whatever reason. Most of them, I think, were to do with, ancient sort of warriors at battle kind of thing. It was shooting, and it was horse riding and sword fighting and all of that sort of thing. These were how the five sports came together. Funnily enough, I think during the Rio Games, I was in Hobart for a football match. I woke on the Saturday morning, flicked on the TV to see what was on at the Olympics, and caught Chloe Esposito's modern pentathlon win. It was one of the most exciting things I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So a sport I'd never watched at the Olympics I'd been to, but it showed how good it can be, and we had success in some of the modern sport at the Tokyo Olympics. So I think we all get behind them, and I think renewal for the Olympics is probably a very important thing, not something I'd thought about it. I'm not sure I'm ready for ballroom dancing, Dan, but I can imagine you'd do a great job broadcasting that when the time comes.
Well, I was Australia's foremost handball commentator, Tim. Mind you, I'm Australia's only European handball commentator because it was a very minor sport in Sydney. And as you know, when you're the host country, you don't have to qualify. You just get an opportunity to compete in every event. So I can take that to my grave, and hopefully that's still a long, long way away. Tim Lane is my guest on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans. You can purchase a property, owner-occupied or investment. You can build a property portfolio, and you can get any sort of loan, whether it be an equipment loan, a car loan, or personal loan. And they've got over 25 lenders on their panel. Now, Tim, do you think Olympic gold medalists in this country and Olympic medalists are lauded enough, or do you think that they don't get enough credit for the success that they have?
It's a very good question. I mean, they're likely to make much more money out of it than was once the case. They weren't meant to make any money at all, but they probably did profit, in various indirect ways back then. But there were strict limitations, of course, on all of that. Now they can profit more directly. There has been a discussion about prize money for swimmers and that sort of thing, but it's a very low level compared to the amount of, the sums of money that are being earned by people in other sports. So I don't mind, the fact that athletes can profit in a financial sense from being successful at the Olympic Games. I know you're Debbie Flintoff-King is one of your guests in this series. I do remember a year or two after the Seoul Olympics chatting with her at the airport one day, and as it turned out, we were, I think, both heading to Adelaide on the same flight. And we got on board. I mean, at the ABC, we weren't used to travelling at the front of an aeroplane, but I think maybe someone I knew had been at the counter, and in those days, they were allowed to just very quietly and informally upgrade people. And so I was travelling on this 1 hour flight in business class, got on the flight with Debbie, and I just felt mortified when I saw her heading down the back of the plane while I was strapping myself in, up in about row 2. And I thought, maybe there could be a way that Olympic gold medalists, people who have brought such honour and glory to this country, could be given some sort of gold pass whereby they, travel at the front of aeroplanes for forevermore, or for 10 years or whatever, something like that. I don't know whether that's manageable, but I know it did make me squirm a little bit on that particular day, because it seemed as though things were sort of tipped on their head. And I have to admit, I didn't offer Debbie my seat, but it somehow didn't feel right.
Look, I agree with you. I think that there are so many great athletes out there now that deserve that opportunity to cash in, and we see a lot of the swimmers do it, and we probably need to see some from those lower profile sports, which hopefully will happen as the years go on. So at this stage, Tim, do you see a long-term future for the Olympics? I mean, we know up to Brisbane 2032, it's locked in, even though, of course, as you said earlier, there's issues with what sort of stadiums we're going to have. Do you see it being something that'll be here forever?
I don't think it's going away, Dan. When you consider that there wasn't an Olympic Games between 1936 and 1948, 12 years, and the Games by 1936 were only 40 years old.
Yes.
And even then they'd had a bumpy ride fairly early on. So, given the time it takes for sporting traditions to become really entrenched By 1936, I could imagine they still would have been somewhat vulnerable, and one might have wondered whether, the hiatus caused by World War II would damage them mortally. But they bounced back. London in 48 was relatively small, and you could imagine that London after the war, it was an incredible feat to actually put the games on. But on they went. The show must go on. And then, Helsinki and then Melbourne. Third games after the war, and it was, I think, probably one of the lesser attended games in terms of athletes and spectators, no doubt, because we weren't as mobile a global population back then. But they had a very powerful effect, and then the games were on an upward curve thereafter, to the point where now we're a bit concerned that they almost need to be pulled back a little bit. So they'll find a way through, because there's such a special event. The fact that they're only held every 4 years is just an enormous strength, I think, because in so much of modern sport, there is this growing idea that more is better. The World Track and Field Championship started out as a 4-yearly event, but then it was also well received that it became every 2 years, and it's not just in athletics that this sort of thing happens, but the Olympics has kind of held its nerve and continues to be 4-yearly, and I think that's its greatest strength, and I think it'll be around long after I've made my last call as a human being on this planet, Dan.
And I would have thought the same for me, Tim. And let's hope so, because we still love watching them now, and they're still a huge part of the Australian DNA. I mean, Australia's been involved in every single Olympic Games from 1896, and we still love it, even though we probably don't pay a lot of attention to it until, of course, the Games are about to get underway. Tim, you've been a broadcaster for over 50 years. You've told me this story a few times, that you sort of got into it accidentally. I think you were at a pub one day in northwest Tasmania speaking to a broadcaster at the ABC, and thought you could call some footy, got an opportunity to do it. Over 50 years later, you're one of the greatest that's ever been involved as a sports broadcaster. Is there a particular moment that stands out in your broadcasting career ahead of anything else so far, even though you've still got a few years to go, I reckon?
Oh, yeah, and it's the one you started with, Dan, Kathy, and that moment in Sydney, 50 seconds.
Yeah.
And it was, just something that Australians were absolutely riveted to. I've sometimes wondered whether anyone was actually listening on the radio. At least there's a recording that is trotted out on programs like this every now and then. But, I think everyone who could was watching it on TV and listening to Bruce, and good on him and good on them. I do remember getting a letter in the period after the Olympics from someone who told me that they'd been on a Qantas flight, which was flying across Central Australia appropriately. The captain of the up in the cockpit put the broadcast across the PA so that everyone on the plane could hear it. And this gentleman who corresponded with me just explained how people were out of their seats and the cheering that went on and all of that. So at least I know that someone somewhere was listening, and the fact that that plane was over the red soil of Central Australia. Well, Kathy Freeman became Australia's 100th gold medalist. Remains a special kind of recollection about the whole thing.
Obviously, the pilot was keen on the race too, Tim. He wasn't going to miss it, whether all the passengers were keen or not. I mean, it was. They always say about the Melbourne Cup, the race that stopped the nation. That was a race. Even my wife at the time, Jodie, not really into it. She was walking through Perth at the time, near the end of her day, and they had a big screen up in the middle of Perth, and everyone who wasn't home stopped to watch it, and even she stopped to watch it. I mean, that's how big an effect that race had on Australia, didn't it, for those Olympic Games?
Did. And look, the issue of reconciliation, as it had been developing through the 1990s, made it much more than just an Indigenous Australian woman competing in this 400-metre event at the Olympic Games. It was like some sort of culmination at that time. Unfortunately, almost a quarter of a century later, things don't seem to have advanced a whole lot more, and it's still deeply complex and troubling. It would be nice for another similar moment of Indigenous achievement and heroism to emerge, so that Australia could rejoice again and again look inside its soul. But that, as much as anything else, was what made that moment so powerful. We've had great victories in a sporting sense. Kieran Perkins coming back and winning 4 years earlier in Atlanta when he barely qualified for the final and looked to have no hope. Things like that, Herb Elliott, Dawn Fraser, Betty Cuthbert, and so on and so forth. But this was one right out of the box because it went way beyond sporting brilliance and sporting achievement. And, it has to be remembered in that way. And, I think it serves all Australians well to remember that and remember the sense of rejoicing that Kathy brought for a nation in those 50 seconds. And everyone who was lucky enough to be there that night will never forget that occasion. And so when I'm asked the question you asked me, is there one standout moment? I don't have to stop and think about it because I think I knew as soon as that was done that there was never going to be anything better than that. There's still been great events, great moments, but there was never going to be anything to exceed that or even equal it in my experience. And I've been right in that.
As you said, Tim, Australia won well over 100 gold medals at the Olympic Games. Do you think there'll ever be a better one than that? You've probably almost answered this question, but do you think there ever will be? I mean,
I think I have. There are great, human stories that unfold and culminate in wonderful and moving victories. The Olympic Games. I don't know about you, but I don't know how many times on the air and off I've had to try and hold back tears and control the lump in my throat when I've been broadcasting, and that's what the Olympics does, and it still does it. And this is the beauty and the glory of it. But for all of those stories, I think in a total Australian sense, it's hard to imagine anything exceeding that. But sport continues to surprise us all. So something will crop up somewhere and which will cause people to gasp and say, well, that's the best ever. And I don't expect to ever see or experiencing anything better than that. However, for me, for now, those 50 seconds on that night, on the 25th of September 2000, remain as good as it ever got. And they'll continue, I feel sure, to remain in that category as far as I'm concerned. Time's running out for me, Dan, so I'm not sure how many opportunities there'll be for other events to kind of equalise that, but that just did the lot.
You're still sounding as good as ever, Tim. As I said, you've had a career that's expanded over 50 years. Do you feel lucky what you've achieved in your broadcasting career?
Incredibly so. I had no idea where life was going to take me when I happened into broadcasting, as you've described. And actually, the guy I was boozing with in the pub wasn't an ABC employee. He worked for a country station, 7AD in Devonport, with a pretty low listenership, I would think it fair to say. And he couldn't pay me. He saw, though, that I was interested. I hadn't approached him about a job. I just was, with a couple of beers and a bit of Dutch courage on board, I was sort of asking him about broadcasting footy matches, how he went about it and so on. And he saw that I was interested, and so he offered me a chance to go along and sort of get a bit of work experience. I didn't get paid, but I went along and was given the opportunity to cope with the experience of having a microphone in front of me and talking publicly, something that had always terrified me. And the first day I went and broadcast with him, I had that lump in my throat. I didn't know whether I was going to be able to control it and get through the first 3 or 4 minutes. But having done that, I then looked forward to the next 3 or 4. And by the end of the first day, couldn't wait for next week to come around. And it did come around, and I'd worked that season with him, and then went looking for work, and I got a job with the ABC in Launceston, part-time initially, and then it turned into a full-time job in Hobart about 18 months later. Came to Melbourne about 6 years after that. So things unfolded as, you hope they will. And I've just been extremely fortunate. I wiped out a uni experience. I still feel somewhat regretful of that, because university, particularly in those days where you went and studied full time, I had to live on the campus at a residential college in Tassie because uni was at the other end of the island. It was a tremendous privilege and opportunity, but I had just none of the maturity required to recognise that and to use it as well as I might have done. I still think I would have loved to have become a sports commentator at the end of it, but I mightn't have gone looking had I, worked more conscientiously and got to, actually achieve what I was hoping to when that uni experience started.
So do you have advice to young people out there, men and women, who want to have a career as a sports broadcaster or a broadcaster or an actor or even be an artist, that it's good to get something else on board as well, or just throw all your eggs into the one basket and have a crack?
It's hard to know what to tell people, and they've got to find their own way. But I think educating yourself is an idea that's got to be good. Having said that, I've got friends who are lawyers and doctors who, there's one in particular who's worked in the law for 50 years, same age as me, and he still feels a sense of regret that he didn't get into sports media. That's what he would have loved to have done. But he was a bit more determined and conscientious about his studies than I was. And so it didn't play out that way for him. So I think you've got to put yourself in the hands of fate, I suppose, to some extent. I've started reading a book, an autobiography by David Williamson, the famous playwright.
Yes, yes.
And he was very similar. He went to uni and studied engineering and fell in an inglorious heap there, and was living the social life of so many of us who have had that experience, particularly living away from home. And he used to imagine that he might become a novelist, but in fact he became a playwright, and is famous for that. And engineering fell by the wayside. So I suppose it'll work out the way it was meant to in some ways. We all have regrets about some things. I still regret the fact that I didn't work harder at uni and that I wasted an opportunity, and it was disappointing for me, but probably even more so for my parents. And my mate, who did go all the way with his studies, regrets the fact that he didn't get into sports media. So these are the complexities of life that we all have to deal with, and just work our way through, and hope we rise above whatever went wrong along the way.
Games are 2 months away, no doubt. Tim, you'll be having a close look at it. How do you reckon Australia will go? I mean, there's a lot of other sports now where they're expected to perform well, compared to even going back to LA. Didn't win a gold medal in Montreal, only won a few in Moscow. Of course, there wasn't every country competing. Same in LA. After then, it's gradually got better and better. But Australia should be going okay, shouldn't they?
Would think so. I mean, you never know, and high times often precede a bit of a downturn. Our swimmers, in particular, were magnificent in Tokyo. And whether they can repeat that remains to be seen. But, there are rising stars in other countries. I don't study the form guide, so to speak, the way I would have when I was working on the Olympics. But I'm sure we'll be very competitive in the pool, and hopefully, as there usually are, there'll be some really nice surprises along the way. And some of those might happen in some of those more obscure sports to old blokes like you and me that get us a little bit interested, at least for an hour or two, on a given day in 2024. I think Paris will be magnificent. I would love to be going there. But a hard part, something that I should say is that if you're working, in a really intense environment at the Olympic Games, you're not seeing the city so much, and you're not seeing the total Olympic Games. So it's one thing to love the idea of going to Paris, but there's a lot you'd miss, I think, by being there as a working media watcher at the Olympics.
Having said that, nothing better than going from your hotel room to the IBC, knowing that particularly someone like me who was more of a minor member of the team or less experienced member of the team at the ABC and the 3 Olympic Games I went, you didn't know what you were going to do from day to day. That was the beauty of these sports, because you only see them once every 4 years. One more, Tim, before I let you go, and Tim Lane's joined me for Dashing Gowns Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans. They deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. They do Zoom as well. Preparation. How much preparation do you do for a sporting event?
Varies. Olympics were I always found the most demanding and intense because there's no fudging. You've really got to make sure you're across. Even the names that haven't been heard a great deal of, because that person whose name you weren't terribly familiar with just might become a gold medalist. I remember the women's 100 hurdles in Barcelona produced such a result. Vula Patalidou from Greece bobbed up, and she had no pedigree, and she finishes up winning the gold medal. So there is all of that to deal with, to have virtually, considered every possibility in preparation. And the Olympics are hellishly demanding, and often, came late in a football season, or in the case of Sydney, shortly after a footy season. And combining the whole lot is very difficult. That's where Bruce McAvaney set an incredible standard. And for anyone who was kind of doing the same job via another medium, as I was, faced the unenviable task of, needing to try and perform to something like the standard that he did. But his knowledge was sheer excellence, and it'd be a long time before anybody betters that. I think that was Olympic and world record stuff.
Well, I think you're right up there, Tim. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years. I'm lucky enough to call you a friend of mine, even though you're a Carlton supporter. I think the Blues are a much better chance than the Dogs this year. As usual, glass 3/4 empty for me. But I really appreciate you joining me today, talking about the Olympics and your wonderful experiences. As I say, second to none as a sports broadcaster in this country. You got to call Kathy Freeman and many other great moments at the Olympic Games. And it's been a great pleasure having you on Dashing Down to Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans.
Appreciate you inviting me, Dan, and great to have a chat with you.
Good on you, Tim. Thanks, mate. It was terrific.